recording starting. So, hello, Duncan. So, we are finally starting our podcast.
Yeah, it's the 2nd of January 2025. Only about a year after we first started talking about it.
Yeah, because I remember last year we started talking about doing a podcast and all of that. And I just feel a bit like in the last year, like everybody got a podcast, which is great. Uh, but we want to, and I think probably everybody says the same. We want to do something a little bit different, no?
Yeah, yeah. Oh no, I'd like to. I think it's important for BetBlocker to start communicating in different mediums. I think when we only communicate via the written medium, we don't engage a lot of different people. But I would like to see this podcast cover a variety of topics, not solely gambling harm in the sector. I think it's important that we cover that and we speak to people with experience, both in the prevention, the experience with harm itself, and the treatment. I think it's important to hear a lot of different stakeholders there, but I do think it's important to hear from other aspects of the gambling sector as well.
Yeah, because it feels like media have become more and more a bit like
Yeah.
an echo chamber. Okay, you only listen to the people that they have the same views, and
Ah,
I tend not to like that. I think like a couple of weeks ago, my wife said, "Oh, are you, listening to these videos of this podcaster?" I said, "Look, I don't agree with this person, but I want to know, like different point of views. I think it's a bit,
I, I,
yeah,
I, I, I certainly agree with that, and I'm guilty of it myself. When you feel strongly about an issue, it's very easy not to listen to the other side. The counterpoint to that, though, is if you listen too much of the other side, all you're going to do is make yourself angry.
and I think this is also, particularly important, because in our area, I remember for the last, you know 10 years until the last 2 years, every single event or conference about gambling was about cooperation. There was like
Mm.
a panel about cooperation, and it feels like in the last 2 years, okay,
I, I,
that's
I don't know that that's changed. If I'm quite honest, what I think has changed is the dialogue within the UK.
mm,
Across the wider sector, the global sector, I think there's still a far more positive and cooperative narrative being conducted. Within the UK, unfortunately, it's become quite polarised. And because the UK leads the sector in so many ways in terms of safer gambling, um, it's casting a long shadow.
mm.
Um, I hope that over the next 12 months we're going to see that narrative change. I mean, we're certainly we saw it at the Gamble Aware conference just at the end of 2025. Tim Miller from the Gambling Commission talking about cooperation and the need to start having a dialogue and listening to all stakeholders. Where for the last 2 years there has been this amplifying move towards closing out dialogue from multiple stakeholders within the sector.
So it's a bit like we're getting to that point in the circle that we're going to start getting closer again, you
Oh,
think?
well, I'm not. I'm not sure. I'm optimistic for that in the UK just yet. I think there are some likely bitter fights still to come,
Mm.
uh, but they have to happen. The reality is that we are not going to end up doing the best to support the people that we need to support by closing down conversation and opting or stipulating that one group's way of doing things is the only good approach.
Okay, let's rewind a little bit. And tell us. I mean, because I know you have been working together for the last 3 years. But for many people that maybe, you know, don't know you. Who's Duncan? You know. I know it's
Oh,
a bit.
give,
It's a
give, give me the
cliche
easy question. Yeah,
answer.
give
Yeah.
me give me the easy questions. Why don't you, Pedro? I mean, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm getting 2 seconds, Pedro. I'm getting there. We go. That's better. Just getting some
Cool.
odd noise in my headset there. Yeah, I started out life. Well, my adult life in university at Heriot Watt,
Yeah.
studying pure mathematics. Uh, after my degree course there, I took a year out, and as I was going back into education, Edinburgh University, doing a postgraduate in teaching, I happened to read the book "Bringing Down the House" by Ben Mesrich. That it's about the MIT card counting team, and read that and went, I could do that. I I I understand the core principles behind it. Dead easy. I I, I then went on to acquire a sizable library on card counting, shuffle tracking, back card play, various other forms of advantage play. Um, I taught myself to card count, and I taught my wife to card count. We while I was a teacher, I was also traveling to America to play with some professional teams who were, I mean, offshoots of the MIT team, founded or run, organized and run by people who were trained by the original MIT team that the people you would know from the bringing down the house. And what was the
I
film?
I think I have seen a movie about
Yeah,
that.
I'm struggling to remember the name of the movie right now. Kevin Spacey was in that one. Um,
The now disgraced Kevin Spacey.
I thought I'd seen headlines recently saying he'd been found innocent. So
Okay.
yeah, I'm backing off saying anything negative about Kevin Spacey. Um, and certainly there are fantastic films that he's led the cast, though I don't think the card counting film was particularly good. But yes, anyway, I spent some time traveling around America playing
Okay. Uh,
on teams.
how were you combining that with teaching?
Good holidays in the summer, good holidays at other times of years, and well, to be honest, I mean, I kind of I took a sabbatical from teaching for a year, and I
Uh-huh.
did a lot of that over that time.
And I don't know, because in the movies, feels a bit like, okay, if you card counting or something, you're going to get the bouncers of the casino to take you to an
Look,
alien.
um, I think if you went back to the 60s and 70s, there's certainly a lot of instances of that type of behaviour. I mean, you've got to realise that the gambling industry, especially in Vegas, was closely tied to the mafia in the early days. Um, so yeah, I mean the mentality trickled through from their origins. In modern times, you'll certainly, I mean, no casino wants people who can beat them playing.
Mm,
You'll certainly get backed off. I know of a few cases where people have been more than just asked to leave detained, but I mean, James Grosjean kind of put an end to that in the early 2000s, I think, when he took a number of casinos to court and won for unfair detention. He ended up shutting down the private investigatory agency that was billing all card counters as cheats and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, I mean it's not, the films like to glamorize the threat.
mm,
It's not the same. It's an uncomfortable social situation to be asked not to come back.
mm. Uh, do you still play from time to time?
Uh, no, would be the answer to that. I would love to. I mean, there's I still from time to time have daydreams about it, but it's not a trivial skill. Small errors quickly undermine any advantage you have. You need to be effectively perfect.
So it sounds a bit like like a mental athletics somehow. No?
It absolutely is, and once you combine it with I mean, the act of card counting itself is not particularly challenging. It's not what everybody thinks it to be. It's not memorizing every card you've seen. No,
Mm,
you know which cards are good, you know which cards are bad, and you have a single number that represents whether there's more good cards left to be played than there are bad cards. Um, but when you then combine that with the casino atmosphere, the
mhm.
environment, dealing with interacting with other players, dealing with interacting with the dealer, keeping the count, sizing your bets correctly, ensuring you're making the right playing decisions, watching the pit to monitor whether you're drawing attention, passing counts to other teammates. Yeah, it it can be very challenging. Um,
Okay.
you need a lot of practice, and you need to maintain that practice. There is no point whatsoever in trying to count cards if you're not putting the hours in. And
What
I don't have those hours these days.
what did you stop playing?
I stopped playing for a couple of reasons. It wasn't really a conscious decision. Um, I I'd taken a sabbatical from teaching, and the truth was I didn't really want to go back to teaching.
Mm,
I really liked teaching, as in the process of teaching, the engaging with classes, building relationships, getting the kids on your side, and pushing them to be the best that they could be. But I didn't enjoy the bureaucratic structures that surrounded teaching. I found them incredibly frustrating. Um, all of the policies that would come down from the politicians dictating what you had to do in your classroom, where the reality is you're checking boxes. I'm going to write this up at the start of every lesson, not because it's helping the kids, not because it's doing anything good for the outcomes of the education, but simply because politicians have got a bee in their bonnet about this particular year, and that's just what we have to do. I found that very frustrating, and to be honest, I found that the same frustrating uh, any time I've worked in larger organizations since, larger structures since. So yeah, while I was taking my sabbatical from teaching, I didn't really want to go back, and I was looking for alternatives. Card counting was a possible alternative, but my wife Lisa was still in teaching,
mm,
and for me to do that professionally would have involved a lot of traveling, being away for months at a time. it's quite a lonely life. And it's not nearly as glamorous as they make out. Certainly, the Kevin Spacey film certainly represented them all living in high roller suites. Yeah, I remember five of us sleeping in one hotel suite, crashing on floors and then on chairs and beds wherever you could find somewhere to lie down. Um, it's not. You're still playing at 4 o'clock in the morning. Your eyes are burning. You've been at it so long. You're running shifts. You can't actually talk to your teammates out while you're playing. It can be lonely. I mean, it's fun. It's certainly I can't deny it's fun, but yeah, it's a taxing life. So around that time, I set up thepog.com,
Mhm.
and that was intended to be an alternative revenue stream to facilitate me not going back to teaching. I used the money that I won um, card counting to start that up. And slowly but steadily, the demands from the POG just became more and more of a drain on my time, and I couldn't maintain the playing to the point where today, I mean, I couldn't find an hour to even shuffle through a deck of cards, and
Uh, I wanted to ask you, during your time as a player, did you encounter, I don't know, like friends or people that experiencing problematic gambling?
no, but then I was dealing with a very specific subset of players who are highly disciplined, who are not there to really engage in gambling. They're there to execute a system that will result in them coming out ahead. There are ups and there are downs, but ultimately they know if they do everything right, they will make money. So the motivation for gambling is entirely different to the average player. I have, however, sat in casinos. I mean, I remember sitting in one casino in the UK actually late at night at a blackjack table watching a player at the other end of the table who is so drunk that he's falling off of his stool, can barely talk. I remember another night watching around Christmas time, work night outs, and watching uh, a player who had won a significant stack of chips, uh, burning through all of that, and then running back and forward to the cash machine, uh, keeping topping up, and getting angrier and angrier and angrier. So, I mean, while I can't say I knew anybody personally that was experiencing gambling at the time, the certainly looking around the casino, it was you were never too far away.
Hmm. Uh, Tell us a little bit more about the POG.
The Pog, the Pog was my effort to um, move into as I say, another revenue stream for myself to allow me to facilitate not going back to teaching, while staying within the area of interest, gambling that I had, and also being able to sleep at night. Um, I was never going to be comfortable marketing gambling as I've seen others do, and as I have certainly as was happening back in the late 2000s, where there was little regulation, little protection for consumers, and bad practices were rife. So I set up with the POG with the idea of providing players well researched reviews, highlighting which operators were treating players fairly. and that's where the POG started. Very shortly after that, I was talked into, though I'll admit I was reluctant at the time, but I was talked into adding dispute mediation. It was you'll know him. It was John Wright that talked me into adding dispute mediation to the POG, and it was a perfect fit for the ethos of the site I was trying to create. So we started managing complaints between players and online gambling operators, and that really took off. Uh, in 2015, I think, was when the UKGC introduced the alternative dispute resolution policies, where every licensee had to list an ADR that the players could refer complaints to for an independent review. The POG applied for ADR status from the regulator, and we were the only affiliate-based ADR to receive approval. There were a number of others that have applied to both the UKGC and the Maltese Competition and Consumer Affairs Authority, the regulatory body in charge of the NGA ADRs, that have never managed to get through that. But I managed to get the POG approved from both entities at various points. So we started to manage complaints officially on behalf of the regulator. I mean, that was a big accolade for us, and it gave us a lot more leverage to ensure that operators were treating players fairly, which really fitted nicely with the ethos of the site. Alongside, sorry, on you go.
What sort of complaints or things were you dealing? You
Oh,
know.
we've seen all sorts over the years. One of the biggest ones I remember was against an unlicensed US operator, who were deploying rigged software, and the player brought us a data set where we could confirm, and there was no possibility. Effectively, they'd played a video poker game,
Mhm.
and over the course of, I think, a couple of thousand hands, had never received a hand of three of a kind of better or better. And statistically, we could show that was less likely than picking one star out of the Milky Way and happening to get our sun. So yeah, I mean, we've dealt with rigged software. That wasn't the only time we've dealt with rigged software. We've dealt with rigged software on a number of occasions. We deal with bonus complaints. We deal with fraud on both the player and the operator sides. We deal with um, gambling harm. They're by far the most challenging complaints to deal with. There's often not as much clarity and regulation as would be preferred to allow for clear and unambiguous decisions to be made. So yeah, I mean, we deal with the full spectrum of cases. There are, it's one of the things I like about working on complaints in this sector is that there's rarely 2 days the same.
Hmm.
You're constantly met with fresh challenges and new problems to unpick.
Uh, you mentioned gambling harm. When you were at the POG. What are the most difficult cases that you have to deal with, or anything that had particular stuck with you?
Oh, there's very few gambling harm cases that aren't difficult. I've heard the regulators talk about why policies are not as clear cut as they should be. I have heard the justifications they've given, and it's generally that they want licensees to strive to be the best, and if they define things too clearly, they will just gravitate that line and never strive to be better. Uh, I understand that as a theory, as a concept, and then it could be positive as a concept, but when we're talking about the realities of deploying policy, it's just unworkable. Because what you end up with is regulation where different parties, different stakeholders take different interpretations of how the rules should be interpreted.
Mm.
And that all too often within the gambling harm related complaints means that the player will interpret the regulations one way, the operator will interpret them another way, and the regulator will interpret them a different way entirely. And you have an ADR that's stuck, or a complaint manager that's stuck in the middle, reading the regulations and saying that any of these could actually be considered the correct interpretation.
Mm.
Which one? It becomes almost personal choice, but that is less of an issue, especially within the ADR space, because the regulators have actually prohibited ADRs from taking on gambling harm related cases. ADRs are restricted to managing transactional issues.
Uh, first I would like to for you to explain a little bit for people that may not know what's an ADR. And second, why do you think that the regulators, they have taken that sort of stand?
Right. ADR is an alternative dispute resolution service, ADR. What an ADR is put in place to do is provide an independent third party assessment of a consumer complaint. The reason that we or reasons that we set up ADR services are that the reality is most consumers won't take a complaint to the courts. The courts are already overburdened. It's very slow. There are potential financial risks to the consumer, and the reality is that the average person would feel very intimidated by the idea of taking a big gambling firm to court. And of course, on top of all of that, you've got the reality that there is a skill set disparity between the parties in a courtroom. Most operators will have their own in-house legal team who are very familiar with their terms and conditions, very familiar with the rules and regulations in the sector. A player either has to represent themselves, or they have to hire a legal firm to represent them who aren't as knowledgeable and experienced in the sector. It creates a disparity that favours the operator. So the ADR system was set up as an effort to create a complaint management process for consumers that carried less friction. It was free for consumers to access. It could be done remotely. There was no need for anybody to turn up in court on any given day. The player didn't need to engage their own. They can, but they don't need to engage their own legal representation. The ADR official should be knowledgeable enough about the rules and terms associated with any gambling complaint. It just rebalanced the system significantly. Now, you asked a two-barrel question there. I've explained what ADRs are. What was the second part?
Why do you think that some regulators, didn't sort of want ADRs to sort of mediate with safer gambling,
safer
issues?
gambling claims. I don't think it was just the regulators. If I'm quite frank, I think there was lobbying from both ADRs who didn't want to deal with the more complicated cases. I think there was lobbying from the industry who didn't want these cases being handed off to ADRs. Regulators, I mean, there are good reasons for not allowing ADRs to review safer gambling complaints. This involves interpretation of regulations, which is very contentious. The regulators also want to see those complaints themselves so that they can monitor patterns and trends in industry behaviour and watch out for wider problems that they need to address. I do understand that. Unfortunately, the consequence of barring ADRs from reviewing gambling harm related cases is that the when we pass a case to the regulator won't intervene in that case directly. It may be the case that as part of a wider action that the regulator takes, that player might get their issue resolved. But the regulator does not make any assurance of interacting or engaging with any specific individual claim. So what tends to happen is claims that are either particularly egregious in their failures, or, and this is a bigger one, for particularly large sums of money, are the ones that the regulator focuses on, and all the lower level, smaller claims simply never get looked at. I'm going to roll back on that just a little bit. Saying they never get looked at is maybe extending a little too far, but it's very unlikely that those claims will have any direct action that results in a resolution for the player.
I mean, because it would make sense, to have someone, to help the little
I
guy from a sort of impartial point of view.
I I have a big problem with this system. Um, it creates a two-tier system where the more you've lost, the more important you are, and that okay, it does provide it does correlate with people who've experienced more severe gambling harm, but it also correlates with those who had more to lose available to lose in the first place, and it creates a two-tier system. Now, average Joe Bloggs in the street loses £500. That £500 within the context of their lives could ruin them. And for somebody who is far higher up the economic ladder, that £500 is inconsequential. The value of money is contextual to your life. So when we only review complaints based on the value of money, we miss many of the consumers who they've experienced devastating losses. It's just that their claim value is lower than the claims that get reviewed.
Okay, do you think like having a ombudsman or something like this will help in the future? Or
I'm certainly within the UK system. There's talk of an ombudsman that's been included in the white paper. I'm certainly supportive of setting up an ombudsman, though within certain parameters. The truth about ombudsman systems in other sectors, and I've used some of the ombudsman systems in other sectors, is that they are very, very slow. The that's the simple reality. Having experience with ombudsman services in other sectors, the years I've waited on getting complaints reviewed would not be accepted within the ADR system that I function as part of within the gambling sector. So I do think an ombudsman is needed. I think that an ombudsman would be an important additional layer within the structure that we have. And it should be set up specifically to review harm related complaints and other complaints of either high value or specific complexity.
Mm.
We need to define the boundaries of what the ombudsman is there to do. But I don't think this should be put in place instead of the ADR system, because the ADR system is far, far more effective at resolving complaints of a lower level faster. So to best support consumers, we need to deal with complaints in this sort of two-tiered fashion.
It's interesting because in the sort of third sector we have the same conundrum right now. So it's be like, okay, we have the charity sector, that is more dynamic, dealing with stuff quickly, and we also have like the health system, that okay can offer a more in-depth support, but normally it works quite slow.
I'm Yes, I am skeptical of the current narrative within the harm minimisation space in the UK. There's a real push to either eliminate the third sector charities, regardless of what the public messaging is. The policies are making clear that the third sector is being viewed as expendable. I think this is really detrimental to the support of vulnerable people in the UK. Um, what what we're seeing with the incoming levy is effectively the nationalisation of the third sector. So those organisations that are not willing to engage in the far more stringent oversight that the levy is going to require will disappear, and those that are will end up far more burdened by bureaucratic need and less able to quickly pivot to address coming needs. Um, it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of this.
Yeah, it feels a bit more, like a medicalization, of sort of problematic, harmful gambling. It feels a bit like, okay, you need to be in this extreme to get help, maybe in a clinic, rather
There's
than, okay, if you're struggling, you can ask for help to charities
there's
and stuff.
certainly. I mean, I'm not the most knowledgeable person
Mm.
on this in the sector. There are others with far more in depth views on what's going on. But from what I have seen, um, the NHS appears to be basically pushing to get all funding put towards the highest levels of treatment. Now, I understand the rationale behind that. It should be high quality treatment that we deliver, but high quality treatment is very, very expensive to deliver. And it's also not necessary for every case of gambling harm. We need a pyramid. And we
I,
need that high quality treatment to deal with those that are most impacted by most severely by gambling harm. But at the bottom of the pyramid, where there's lower levels, or the middle of the pyramid, where there's lower levels of the severity of harm, we need wider access to support, and that support can be as simple as having a lived experience counselor on the other end of the phone to talk to somebody at a point of crisis, to try and guide, to tell them it's okay. I've been there. I understand. Because for somebody in that at that point of crisis, having that frontline support is critical. Yeah, it's great. It's great. In 8 months, I can get proper treatment on the NHS, high level treatment on the NHS. But if there is nobody delivering that lower tier support, immediate support, we're failing.
It would be great that at some point we have, people from the NHS in the podcast, and we can talk to them to you know, pick the brains, because
It would,
it's all about, you know,
you've got to
yeah,
listen to everybody. I've expressed
yeah.
some strong views just in the last 15 minutes. Um, but you have to listen and you have to hear, why are you doing this? What what is the reasoning behind the decisions being made? Because if you don't have the context, criticizing them is irrelevant.
Uh, going back quickly to the ADR, because
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask something, but we just went a bit
Ah,
down
yeah.
the rabbit hole. How how does it normally work? For example, was the poke funded by, I don't know, like ads, or not the poke, like the ADR? Um, was did you get funded by, the regulator, or by
No.
the complaints, or by?
The there are two primary modes of monetization of an ADR. The most common structure is that they bill the operator per complaint or per batch of complaints, or an annual fee. There's always some sort of fee that's charged directly to the operator so that the player can interact with the service without any costs. The other approach to monetization is the one that I created in terms of ADR, is to use affiliate marketing to generate revenue for the project and not charge either party for the complaint management.
Because my first thing is like, okay, if the operator are paying you, even if you're impartial, you know, it may create some sort of, suspicion on the complainer.
There,
Okay, so if
there's
this
uh,
company
uh,
is funding you, you probably are going to take their side.
well, that certainly is understandable, and yeah, they're reasonable concern to have. What I would say to that is that, firstly, the service is going to have to be funded from somewhere. And even if your regulator are managing complaints instead, the regulator are still generating money by licensing fees that the operators and the industry are paying. Um, no matter how you set this up, there is always going to be a dynamic where the industry ends up paying for the management of complaints, whether regardless of which party you set that or structure you use. The only difference to that, the only exception to that, is the court systems. What I would say as well is my personal opinion and why I chose to set up the ADR in the way that I did is that I feel it allowed for far greater flexibility and far more transparency and a higher level of independence. When you're talking about a fee per complaint type ADR, if they get into a disagreement with an operator about the outcome of a complaint, that operator could choose to terminate their agreement with that ADR and switch to another service. At that point, the ADR has lost all future revenue from managing complaints against that operator. It's just gone. Working under the affiliate marketing model, if an operator decided that they were unhappy with our complaint management and they were going to terminate their agreement with us and switch to another ADR, all we would do is we would remove their advertisements from the site and put another group in their place. This allows us to divert the revenue, so we're not actually losing anything if an ADR client switches away from us. There are nuances to that within the affiliate agreements. There's quite often minimum activity clauses, things like that. So the terminating partner could try and seize historic revenue. But there were ways for us to mitigate that. And this meant that yeah, I mean, great, okay, you're unhappy and you want to leave our ADR service, fine. We'll just work with a different partner to market with, and it doesn't impact as significantly as a complete loss of revenue that other ADRs would see.
Following with POG and ADR, what how come that BetBlocker was born? Because you told me several times the story, but it was a bit like, okay, I went with a friend for a few beers. Can you
Yeah,
tell us
yeah,
the story?
certainly. It was around about 2016, I would say. We were seeing a sharp rise in the number of gambling harm related complaints that were getting submitted to the POG. Now, I mean, Pedro, you've worked in several roles where you've had to manage harm related complaints, and I know you've seen some of the harrowing and traumatic cases that end up resulting. I was Well, let me just parse this and say that I don't think the increase in these claims was due to some massive jump in gambling harm that had occurred at the time. What had happened is that the UKGC had come into the market just a couple of years previous, and consumers were becoming more aware of their rights. We would have even consumers from outside of the UK submitting gambling harm related complaints quoting UKGC standards because they didn't understand that the UKGC rules didn't apply to them. This was just consumers, as I say, becoming more aware of their rights. But it didn't change the reality that we were dealing with a lot more of these cases. I wanted to find other services that we could signpost for these people to help them get support. It's the bottom line. A lot of these cases, as harrowing as they were to review, that we couldn't always help. It's great when, well, actually, I've just been telling you how ADRs aren't allowed to review harm-related claims. So that restricted us when we were acting officially as an ADR. When we were acting informally, quite often, if the operator thought that they were not in a position to robustly defend themselves and win the case, they just wouldn't correspond with us about it at all. So we couldn't always get players' money back from them in these cases, and I wanted to do something more than say, sorry, we can't really help you. I wanted to do something more to try and signpost support.
Where do you think that sort of empathy, came from? Because I suppose that you may have other ADR companies that they say, yeah, that's not our job, sorry, or they just have a template, send the template.
A grotesquely exaggerated form of ego and self-importance. I've always been far too quick to stick my nose into other people's business.
I'm going to fix this. No?
Yeah, exactly. I'm a fixer. I try to fix things. So yeah, I started looking around for what support services we could signpost, and the first thing I wanted to look for was blocking software. Specifically, even back then, I didn't think blocking software was a magic bullet to fix gambling addiction, but what it would do was buy time to allow somebody else to get more robust support. And when I looked around at the blocking softwares that were available on the market at the time, I was disheartened to realize that they were all subscription based. They all wanted to charge the user for support. And for me, that just fundamentally didn't work. In the first instance, the people that I'm dealing with have already experienced severe gambling harm. And one of the primary markers is financial distress. These people have already lost more than they can afford. Quite often, they don't know how they're going to pay next month's rent. They're not sure how they're going to get their kids' school uniform or put food on their table. Telling them that they had to go and pay to get help just didn't sit comfortably with me. And on top of that, when you put a paywall in between somebody who's experiencing gambling addiction and support, what you guarantee is that those that are most severely impacted are the least likely to be able to access the support. Those who have lost the most will be the least likely to be able to pay to get help. It's that simple. So I was sitting one night shortly after looking at this, having a few beers with a friend of mine, John Wright, and I had a few beers, and I went on a bit of a rant about how unfair I felt this was, and it went on for quite a period of time. And eventually, John got frustrated with listening to me and told me that, well, if I feel so strongly about it, maybe I should just go away and set up my own blocking software and give it away for free. And that if that's what I wanted to do, he would help me. So that's what I did. We initially set BetBlocker up as part of the POG. It was intended to be part of our branding exercise. We wanted to be seen as a socially responsible affiliate, and that was seriously lacking back then. It's slowly changing. There are more affiliates that are prioritizing social responsibility today. I mean, you can look at the likes of Casino Guru and their global self-exclusion initiative. There are more affiliates that are starting to talk about this and starting to want to be seen as a socially responsible citizen within the sector. But back in 2016, 2017, it really wasn't happening. So BetBlocker was a branding exercise for the POG. It was us putting our money where our mouth was.
Because I think it's a shame, because an affiliate that at some level could play a key role, in the positive and also in the negative side. You have affiliates that can put players in danger, and other affiliate that they could do something positive.
I think it's more than a shame. I think this is a massive failing in terms of how the sector has approached minimizing gambling harm. We have ignored or belittled affiliates when we should have been looking to engage them. The truth of the matter is that so much of the messaging around prevention of gambling has been very, very negative. It's all about harm. It's all about risk and the spiral into despair. And that's because of the background of the people creating the messaging. Many of them have experienced gambling harm themselves. They see gambling as a negative. Well, I hate to say this, but the audience we are trying to reach doesn't see gambling that way. It doesn't. These are people who engage in gambling as a form of entertainment and recreation. They're there to have fun. And when we push this negative messaging, we rapidly lose engagement with that audience. The sector of the market who is best educated, most skilled in terms of communicating with players is affiliates. That's what they do day in and day out. They work out how do we say this? What image do we want to use? What music? What video do we want to use to engage players as an audience? Their
I mean,
livelihoods depend on it. We should be tapping that resource and bringing affiliates in and encouraging them to find ways to communicate messages about the prevention of harm. It's a huge own goal to have so sidelined the affiliate sector in the communication on safer gambling.
I do, understand, what you're saying, So if you know, bring a message, that, you know, of of course, and those cases are real, and I have seen many of them, but nobody wants to see themselves, you know,
No,
in the stigmatized role. It's okay, So I'm not, I don't drunk drive, therefore I'm not going to put my seatbelt. Okay, you need to put your seatbelt regardless. You don't need to have a car accident or be irresponsible with your car to to
uh,
have to
absolutely.
do
Look,
basic safety stuff. It's
the messaging we have created engages those that already identify themselves as impacted with gambling harm. And that's fine. That's not a bad thing. We need to reach that audience as well. We need to reach that audience and signpost them to the services that are available to help them deal with the issue that they have identified. But we also need to reach the far larger audience that does not identify itself as experiencing gambling harm at this stage. And while I say they don't identify, that doesn't mean they're not experiencing gambling harm. It's just that they have not acknowledged the harm that they are experiencing yet. And if we can reach that far larger section of the market, if we can communicate effectively to them, we can stop or slow the migration of people from these lesser levels of harm to the more severe levels of harm where people start to acknowledge that they are impacted.
this I get it. It's about tailoring your message for the whole spectrum. Okay, you don't need to be morbidly obese, to eat healthy. Everybody should be
Yeah,
eating healthy, or okay, so you don't need to be an alcoholic, to get messages against. Okay, you can suffer from drinking related harm without being in a
being
sort
an
of
alcoholic.
disorder,
Yeah,
end of the spectrum.
absolutely, and that's where I think we have been falling down, and that is where we need to change. I I'm actually I watch a lot of the gambling advertisements on UK TV here, and I think that the industry is learning this lesson quicker than us. So maybe not for the same reasons. So many of the adverts on TV in the UK include some messaging around watching how you're playing, keeping it within a safe limit. Oh, that it's time for a timeout. I don't need to play just now. He's decided not to. That's far more likely to engage the average consumer than a message about the misery and consequences of gambling addiction, of the risks. I acknowledge that the industry tends to be doing that because they want a softer message on safer gambling, and that's fair enough. We have to acknowledge the motivations behind the messaging. But the reality is they are likely. I would place money on it if we did focus groups with consumers, with average players. Players would find those messages far more engaging than our doom and gloom.
Uh, Let me ask you: Is BetBlocker, a tool for the sort of end of the spectrum in your view? I'm asking you
Yes,
all the.
yeah. Yes and no. Yes and no. Blocking software generally, I would say, is a crisis management tool. Your standard block, that is, I want to block for the next year and I don't want to be able to play at all. It's a crisis management tool. When people engage with blocking software in that way, it tends to be after they've just lost more than they are comfortable with. They might not be at full blown financial crisis, but they're saying, "Oh no, I've spent too much," and they're panicking a bit, and they're saying, "I don't want to play anymore." So generally, I would say that blocking software is for the more severe end of the spectrum in that respect. However, BetBlocker's taking a different approach. We do offer those standard continuous blocks, but we're also offering what we are calling our scheduling tool. Now, what this allows people to do is plan in advance. So, for instance, if you want to make sure your bills are paid before you play, you can look up your payday each month and set the block to come on for a week after payday. If you know that on a Friday night when you're out and you've had a few beers, you're a bit guilty of gambling a bit too much when you get home, you can set the block to switch on Friday nights and switch off on Saturday morning. If you want, if you find that, do you still want to place your bets before a match starts, but the in-play betting is a bit of a problem for you? You can set the block to come on during the match. The whole point of the scheduling tool is to empower players to take control. They know themselves better than we know them. Is to empower players to take control and start managing themselves. Start just doing the simple, sensible things that will keep them playing at an affordable level. So, from that respect, I would say that while every other blocking software is focusing on the most severe end of the spectrum, BetBlocker is also trying to take a harm minimization approach and is trying to message for the far larger group of the bell curve that represents average players.
One thing that it comes to mind is that being a moderate these days, is a bit not marketable. If you say, okay, we offer this, but we also offer something that offers harm minimization. Is okay, no breaks or complete breaks. Okay, why do you think, you know, it's maybe
Right, you're speaking to, yeah, you're absolutely right. I consider myself as an ADR, as a complaint manager, a professional fence sitter. I try and see things from both sides before I draw any conclusions. So yes, being a moderate is not a popular voice today. Why do I think it's unpopular? I think that there are multiple reasons for that. I think the first is that many of the loudest voices in the harm minimization space have been significantly impacted by gambling harm. That's just the reality. Now, those voices are important for us to hear, but when they dominate the narrative, that's not necessarily a positive. We Many of the lobbyists and campaigners are coming from that background and view gambling simply as a negative. It's also far easier to engage an audience with a polarized argument. That's just the reality. You'll see this in the press. Our media today is a business, and it is monetized and marketed and driven by clicks. When the Daily Mail publishes a story about somebody who has experienced severe harm, has maybe lost their home and their family and their job, or has committed suicide due to gambling harms, that will drive far, far more clicks than a moderate story that talks about the balance of regulation and how we need to do more here, or we need to rethink this here. That story isn't sensational enough to drive the clicks that the media is looking for. So what we end up getting is these very polarized, high octane outrage stories constantly being published. And that's not to say that those stories don't need attention. They do need attention. Where people have experienced these levels of harm and there have been failings, we need to look at them. But that shouldn't be the only narrative. And the way that our media sector works simply doesn't allow for that.
Well, I suppose that because I can put myself in the shoes, and I could say, look, if something or someone that I love, was terribly damaged, because probably I'll do all my within my means,
Absolutely.
to
Absolutely. Look,
to fight it. Uh, at the same time, I feel like, okay, people that they have suffered from moderate damage, be like, okay, I I don't know, I lost a semester at university because this, but then at the end, I end up passing my exams. I it's not that important for me, to campaign moderately, or to get involved, or
the very nature of, and this isn't something that's exclusive to gambling. It's in all areas of life. Generally, the people who campaign hardest and try to raise funds for cancer research are those who have been impacted by the loss of a loved one or recovery from cancer themselves. It's when an issue impacts you personally, that's when you feel the drive and the motivation to really get involved and start campaigning for improvements. So it's natural that within the gambling sector that the people who have been most negatively impacted by gambling are the ones who are really campaigning for change. The problem with that is, and as I said, all stakeholders need to be heard, and these stakeholders specifically have important feedback to give us. But the problem is that the vast majority of the consumers who are engaging with gambling have not been negatively impacted the way that these individuals have, and won't necessarily view the policies that these individuals are campaigning for as right for them. And I think you're seeing that right now in the UK in terms of the source of wealth requirements that are becoming more and more prevalent. The reality is, while I understand what the motivation is to try and identify that people that need more protection earlier, average players, average consumers are not happy giving away the type of information that they need to give away to comply with a source of wealth check. We are
well,
we are frustrating the vast majority of players to try and protect the most severe, the small number of the most severe cases.
okay, imagine that I'm a gambling company, and I'm asking you, hi Duncan, you have spent this month, I don't know, 1,000, or you have deposited 1,000. Uh, can you, provide information about your tax returns, your payslip, your, a couple of bank statements of the month?
I've played online, and basic KYC was always something that irrationally boiled my blood. When they start asking for proof of address, oh no, that document's not been accepted. Um, it just frustrated and annoyed me. when an operator starts asking for more documentation than the player would have to provide to get a mortgage, it's understandable that most people just know. I'm not giving a gambling company that information about me. And the reality is, and the result is, that the majority of players confronted with a source of wealth check simply don't comply and go and find somewhere else to play. And the truth of that then is we're not catching. This policy isn't helping us catch the people that need support because the majority of people are just not complying with it and going somewhere where they don't have to provide that information.
Where is that?
Oh, it can be another licensed operator who isn't aware of the requests that have been made by the original operator, but it can also be the black market, where there are large numbers of crypto based gambling operators who are specifically marketing themselves as no KYC casinos.
Okay, what are your, from your perspective, the main dangers of the black market?
The black market is pervasive and the single biggest threat to every legitimate stakeholder in the legal market, be that regulators, operators, or players. The black market is the biggest threat to all of them. Um, the biggest concern for me right now with black market is the way that it is fundamentally marketing itself to undermine um, gambling harm protections. So again, look, I'm talking a lot from the UK because the UK is my perspective, but this is just as valid in almost all of the regulated markets to date. But you look at like the national self-exclusion schemes like GamStop, and the black market will market itself specifically as a way round GamStop. What that means is that we have a higher proportion of the people who are going to black market operators who are already self identified as having experienced gambling harm. Alongside this, the black market is marketing heavily using influencers and streamers. I'm an old fart. I'll be. I'm past the point where I would claim I was young anymore. I'm not engaged by influencers. I'm afraid I find it quite an off-putting media format. But the truth is, our youth are very, very engaged with social media and social influencers. So what you're again seeing is you're seeing a skewing of the consumers that are most likely to end up going to the illegal markets towards young people
Uh,
who
you know,
study after study is shown are more likely to experience gambling harm.
uh, what can be done? Because I suppose I don't know. I have heard outside of the gambling industry. I don't know, like cases where I don't know, like influencers, like personalities, were sort of marketing on online or in social media platform, like I don't know, like a type of crypto coin or a crypto exchange, and then they got into serious trouble. Why do because that could happen with any influence. Okay, you're promoting a unregulated casino, so we're going
It's
to.
it's it's challenging because you generally need to be able to reach the influencer. And if they are set up in a country where it's effectively legally impossible to touch them, um, yeah, it becomes difficult to take any direct action against the influencer themselves. But I mean, our approach to disrupting the black market, and I use the word disrupting very consciously. There is no stopping it, in my opinion. This is an arms race. Every time we take steps to advance the way that we are targeting and shutting down the black market, they are going to take steps to try and find ways to get round us. There's too much money on the table for them not to do that. We need to take a multi layered approach. So we need to deploy strategies to disrupt as much of it as we can. Now that can be transaction blocking at banks. It can be takedown notices to server hosting companies and ISPs. It can be, and I think this is something we really need to look into. We can apply more pressure to the big tech firms like Google, Facebook, Twitch to ensure that any content targeted at the UK is marketed or is compliant with UK laws, and where it's not, place the onus on Google. Google should not be including search terms that specifically help vulnerable people circumvent GAMSTOP.
But it feels a bit like we're always late, because the conversation about the black market have been there for, I don't know, 5 years. Until very recently, a lot of regulators, they were hiding the heads under the sand. It's good that they recently, some of them, they have acknowledged that
I would
actually
say
there's a problem. But it's like,
I
okay,
would say over
so
a decade, well over a decade, since the industry started to shift from international licensing authorities to national regulators, problems with the black market have been prevalent. And actually, no, I'm going to scrap not 10 years, not a decade, try 2 decades.
yeah,
Because we saw the US and the UEGA Act that prohibited
yeah,
banks processing transactions to gambling firms created a massive black market in the US. The US is slowly moving away from that as states start to regulate online gambling, but they prohibited it for a decade and a half.
Yeah, I think you are right. I was mainly thinking about crypto casinos.
Yeah,
But I think since day one of the internet, you always have those
part of it.
operators overseas that
And you-
no
You're
questions
always,
asked.
yeah, you're always going to have scammer businesses. It's not just in gambling; it's
Yeah,
everywhere.
like
Um,
pharmaceuticals, knockoff products, whatever. Yeah.
gift coupons and discount merch that really is just shoddy knockoffs. It's always the same. And the internet. I mean, there are so many wonderful things that the internet has given us all. This podcast, for one, we couldn't do this without the internet. But the reality is we opened Pandora's box when we created the internet, and there are a lot of negatives that came with the internet and smartphones and all of these technologies that have popped up in the last 15 years. And the gambling black market is just one of those.
I was going to say that, oh, you sound like my granddad talking about Pandora's box, but I think my granddad was dead before the internet, so that shows my
Well,
age too.
I mean, I would talk about Pandora's box and the internet specifically in relation to gambling harm. It has wider connotations for a lot of other things, but the simple truth is that as a species, we were never evolved to have this level of access to a stimulus like gambling.
Everything.
Even prior to the internet, if you wanted to place a bet, and there were still plenty of people who were experiencing gambling harm prior to the internet, but if you wanted to gamble, you had to go somewhere and gamble. That meant going to a bookies, going to a casino, going to a poker room.
Making a call, the old
Yeah,
betting.
yeah, absolutely. Whereas now, with the invention of the internet and with the invention of smartphones, what we've really ended up at is everybody is carrying around a sports book, a casino, a bingo hall, a poker room in their pocket all of the time. Within 2 clicks, within 10 seconds, they can be gambling. They've taken a toilet break at work, may as well have a few spins. I'm on the bus, may as well have a few spins. We weren't evolved to cope with that. Now we can't close Pandora's box. We can't package it all away, and we shouldn't want to. There are plenty of real positives that have come from the internet and the ability to communicate with people so far away so easily. But we
Uh,
are going to have to develop strategies to cope with the negative consequences of these technologies.
and I think what there's a will, there's a way. I remember that, I don't know, like in the 2000s, you pretty much could find any movie by just Googling, like, and now it's a bit more difficult. If you want to see a stream on the day, okay, you may need to spend a bit of time, you may
Well,
find it, but it's not that accessible. I wanted to focus a little bit, because I'm a bit conscious of time, about the levy, because we're just in 2025. The levy is around the corner. There's a few things that they're not entirely clear. What are your views? What do you think is going to happen?
oh, it's anybody's guess. Right, certainly the messaging that we have heard from the funding commissioners that have been appointed so far strongly suggests that any charity that has been accepting funding from the industry, and that includes charities that have been accepting funding via the UKGC approved RET system, will be ineligible to receive funding from the new levy. Now, I, I'm 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 in two minds about this. I mean, I understand the thinking that has led people to this place, but I don't agree with it, at least in all cases. The premise behind this is that receiving funding directly from the industry in some way corrupts the work that you are doing to minimize harm. And in other words, you're not you're not being genuine. You're not actually trying to minimize harm. There are sectors of the third sector that I would say that is an appropriate concern. When we look at, for instance, research, we have seen how industry funding in other sectors has corrupted research in the past. Now, I appreciate the academic systems have far more robust checks in place these days to prevent that, but it has still happened in the past. We might want to ensure there is a firewall between industry funding and the research projects for the simple reason that even if the checks are robust enough to prevent any influence on the outcomes, public perception is will always undermine, will always view research funded by the industry as compromised. And that kind of defeats the value of conducting the research in the first place if the public won't accept it.
But there's always people that they're not going to accept research.
Anything.
Like
Oh, no, absolutely.
any medical research, or most of the medical research. Okay, there's
Ah,
someone that sits in the board of this, or I've been, it's this is
no,
why,
they're
in any
absolutely.
research paper there's a section that is conflict of interest. It needs to be peer review. So it's be like, okay, maybe it's not perfect, but it's as good as it gets.
Absolutely, and I completely agree. Um, my point on this one is simply about public perception,
Hmm.
and if we can say, well, the funding from that didn't come directly from the industry, it helps bolster some public perception, and it makes it more difficult to undermine the credibility. Well, there will be academics and individuals with significant stakes
What
who
about
will always question,
the
but
public perception with charities? So imagine that, you say, oh, GamCare or Gamble Aware receive money from the industry. So what do you think is going to happen? That at the end of a support call, they're going to give you voucher for,
Exactly. And this is what's well. This is I was starting that discussion out with the one exception. The reality is, though, for the vast majority of other types of gambling support charity, what is it that the funding commissioners are saying is happening? This funding is being used in a way that isn't delivering its intended purpose. Take BetBlocker, for example. How do you think that delivering blocking software is being compromised by receiving funding from the industry? Do you think that at the end of a block we're saying, well done, great job, why don't you take these 10 free spins and go and relax? Do you think we're missing off operators who donate to us from our block list? Because that would be quickly identified. There's nothing that we can do that compromises the integrity of our product. What it really comes down to is how negatively you message about gambling. And we don't want to message negatively about gambling. That's not the purpose of our charity. If you read our charitable constitution, our charitable purpose is to deliver free blocking software to anybody who needs it. That's an apolitical goal. That's not something that requires us. We don't have in our charitable constitution. We will lobby for the prohibition of gambling or the changes of policies. We don't do that. If I want to go and lobby for political changes, I need to go and do that separate to BetBlocker.
you know, I, I, I do, I do get it, but would it be really easy, to find out? Because it's all based in sort of a great thing, they have any proof, okay, this charity has done this terribly wrong thing, and it's in,
It's
I th-
and that
there's plenty of charities, and they have been doing the job for a long time. I suppose that something will be out there by now.
Exactly. The reality is, this isn't coming from a place of evidence. These policies aren't coming from a place of evidence. They are coming from individual bias and from lobbying by certain anti gambling organizations to press for more restrictive policies. Now, the same organizations that are lobbying for the restriction in funding are organisations who have set themselves up specifically to benefit from this funding and have positioned themselves to benefit from other charities being excluded.
What do you mean? Could you be a bit more specific?
Absolutely. I'm not naming anybody here because I don't want to get into that. But there are organisations, there are charities who have lobbied very, very hard for the exclusion of for funding of any organisation, any charity that accepted funding from the industry. When they have lobbied in this way, what they have been trying to do is exclude their competition because they're excluding organisations that otherwise would be applying for the same funding that they're going to apply for. There's a clear incentive for them to want. Don't get me wrong. I'm certainly not questioning their underlying the strength of their underlying dislike of the industry and the harm that they have experienced because of the industry. But I can also see the financial benefits to them for pushing for these rules.
I mean, something that that concerns me, is a bit like the prohibition, the a prohibitionist approach in terms that it hasn't worked. I'm not a person that is particularly fond of gambling, but I'm really against any sort of uh, prohibitions of any sort
I
of
think
uh, you know alcohol, substances, even smoking. I think it's a personal choice. I dislike it, but if you want to do it and you know what's involved and the risk, I
I
rather you not to do it. But I
I
think your
I compl-
freedom
I
should
completely
prevail.
agree. Any time we prohibit something that there is public demand for, we don't end up restricting access. We just create a black market. I mean, the classic example of this is a sex trade. Look, I'm no fan of the sex industry or prostitution in general, but the reality is that when we prohibit prostitution, what we do is we create a black market where the women who choose to engage in that profession are at far, far higher risk than they would be if we regulated it and controlled the market. And you see the same. You've seen the same in the alcohol prohibition in the United States. Didn't result in an end of drinking. In fact, it just created an absolutely massive booming black market where many of the biggest political players were actively facilitating and profiting from this black market. It's the same with gambling. We can't stop online gambling. We can't even stop the black market when we have a legal market. Prohibiting gambling isn't going to work.
Uh, I've been listening to your cats. A bit like meowing. And I'm always have been fascinated. About you and how many cats you have.
Right now we've got six. You're hearing them meow because one of them's shut out of the room and wants in. There's another one who is anxiously pacing round and round and round me because he wants out of this room. But yeah, I've got six at the moment. Most of which have been taken in as strays who are living around my house.
Uh, how did you get into being a
I've always had cats. My
okay?
parents had two cats before I was born. We've always had usually two. Um, I, I would say I've taken it to extremes since moving out and getting my own place. But we never really wanted this many cats. But I'm not going to open the curtains, but anyone in the UK today likely knows that it's thick snow on the ground, it's freezing outside, and I I can't live with myself knowing that there's a cat out there in that cold struggling to get by when they could be in here warm and safe and looked after. So I mean, six is moderate for us. We were up at nine about 2 years ago, but we sadly we lost three of them due to various illnesses. And I do have another one that I have been tracking for about 2 years now that I think we will catch
So it
in the
was
next month or so.
it was always something that I do. I think it tells something about the person. That if you care for if you yeah.
It's a strong statement to make, but I honestly do believe that the way a person treats animals tells you a lot about who they are and the attitude they have towards life.
Uh, do you think that we have left something unsaid in our first podcast or
I
something like?
I think we are trying people's patience at our 5 minutes.
Yeah, so yeah. I mean, time just flew. I just
Yeah,
checked
absolutely
and
has.
was like 1 hour and a half and going, and let's see. But something that I would love, is to anyone that wants to be here to drop us an email or a direct message to Duncan or myself. We will be, co-hosting this podcast, and we just want to talk a little bit with everyone, and have their their thoughts across, and try to, you know, understand and and also have a good time.
Absolutely. Just interesting conversations. That's what I'd like to see here. Insightful thoughts on the gambling sector and on the prevention of harm and the treatment of harm. Absolutely would be that's what I want from this podcast.
Awesome. So I think we just reached the end of our first episode. No, Duncan?
Absolutely. I think this is a good place to end it. Thanks for having me, Pedro.
Awesome. You take care and catch up later.
You too.
Bye.